Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for this evening's devotions. For those in the Bloomington Normal area, I just have to say it's nice to hear a little bit of thunder kind of rumbling through, but it is good to be able to kind of step back in here and have some time together in the presence of the Lord and in one another's virtual company as we're checking in together with each other. So glad you joined us. I wanted to share a devotional as part of again, from Eugene Peterson's Living the Message. This one seemed appropriate. On Sunday evening, Helen and Paul were talking about the prophet Jeremiah and was talking to our junior high youth and all the rest of us that tuned in about how God chose Jeremiah from before he was born. And it's interesting that kind of coincidentally, or along the same time, this is kind of what Eugene Peterson's talking about as well. So I want to share this devotional that he wrote. And he writes, "Before Jeremiah knew God, God knew Jeremiah. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." This turns everything we ever thought about God around. We think that God is an object about which we have questions. We are curious about God. We make inquiries about God. We read books about God. We get into late night bowl sessions about God. We drop into church from time to see what's going on with God. We indulge in the occasional sunset or symphony to cultivate a feeling of reverence for God. But that is not the reality of our lives with God. Long before we ever got around to asking questions about God, God has been questioning us. Long before we got interested in the subject of God, God subjected us to the most intensive and searching knowledge. Before it ever crossed our minds that God might be important, God singled us out as important. Before we were formed in the womb, God knows us or knew us. We are known before we knew. Like an open book, you have watched me grow from conception to birth. All the stages of my life were spread out before you. The days of my life all prepared before I'd even lived one day. Psalm 139:16 in the Message translation. That just it gets me to be thinking, so much of our life, of the way that we approach life, even as Eugene Peterson says, the way that we approach God starts out, in one sense, as it must, from our perspective. What are we thinking? What are we perceiving? What are we pondering about God? But one of the amazing realities that Scripture invites us to contemplate, and that reality often forces us to contemplate as well, is that this is not our story. We get to be a part of it, but we're not at the center of it. This is God's story, and that reality invites us to look at things the other way around. One way I was just kind of tossing this around in my mind, and I don't know if you're the same way, if you play board games or computer games where you have to take turns, and you can spend forever thinking about moves. If you're playing checkers or chess, if I do this, then what's going to happen here? What are the other moves that could happen? What could the other person do? What's the most advantageous thing for me to choose or to do? And yet, if Eugene Peterson's right, if Scripture is right, then that whole way of thinking of things really gets turned around and invites us to begin asking, what's God up to? When I make my choices, when I make my decisions, what does God think about that? What does God have that's part of God's bigger story that God's inviting me to be a part of? And what does that look like? So rather than making all of those choices around myself and my own perceptions, how do I, while acknowledging, that God has called and created and formed each one of us, myself included, as people who are valued and important and loved, none of us are at the center. And then what does that shift in our way of approaching one another in the world and God, who approaches us first with grace and love? Maybe some I feel like saying, like, what is that, Saturday Night Live, deep thoughts? Yeah, anyway. Those are my thoughts anyway for this evening, reflecting on Eugene Peterson's Living the Message. Wherever you are, may God bless you and be with you on this journey. God's peace to you.